Hello and welcome to a brand new case study, or as they say on the TV, an all new case study. I've never been quite sure how you can have a new episode without it being an all new episode. Anyway, we've just been looking at science in the last case study, and this time we're going to have a bit of a look at business and economics. We're also going to continue with the sort of technical trend that we had from the last case study. So in the last case study, we looked at the water levels, and in the lab you've also done this looking at the rainfall, where you've tried to look at the trend over time. So we've got what we call time series data that's been collected over time. And we want to see what kind of trends are there. Now, you remember in the last case study, we talked about the fact that one way to look for trends was to try and look for a function that we knew more about and see how that compared with the data we had. So, for example, we looked at a comparison with the mean. So for example, in the sea level data, we plotted the data against the mean, and we showed that for more recent data it was above the mean, and for earlier data it was below the mean. And so what we want to look at now is how we can quantify that. So we could sort of see it by looking at it, but how do we really quantify that to verify what we think we're seeing? So we're going to look at those differences in terms of something we call residuals, and we're also going to look at function, in this case lines, that more accurately fit the data that we've got, so that we compare the data against those lines and the trend which is clear from the line. So we're going to be looking at things like lines of best fit and regression. So quite a few new concepts in this case study. We're going to be looking at some statistical or machine learning type concepts. So the idea of models, a model for our data, linear models, residuals, error metrics, and as I mentioned, lines of best fit, how we might find a line that fits our data, and the idea of linear regression. We'll also introduce a few more programming concepts, two-dimensional arrays, and some small things like Boolean values of empty strings, the idea of not a number. Exceptions, they're actually quite an important programming concept. Some of you I know have come across before, but that's really quite important for a bit of robustness in the way that we read in our data. More about ambiguous data, we've talked about this a bit before, or missing data. We will look at an example of a method on an axis of an array, which again is quite an important concept. And I'm also going to use the Seaborn plotting package, although we won't talk a lot about that. We'll also reinforce some of those concepts that we've seen before, and in particular we're going to use the CSV library. We've already introduced that in this week's lab sheet. But we'll have an example of using that here. And in the last case study, we talked about masking data and line plots, and we'll use those again. So, onto the subject matter of this case study. So, as this picture suggests, it's going to be about gross domestic product, which is a measure of goods and services consumption. So we're going to asked the question, has Australia's per capita GDP been in trend decline for decades? And I'll show you where that claim comes from. So that's a picture of our Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg there, announcing that Australia is in recession for the first time in 29 years, which in itself is a remarkable record. So on Wednesday, 3rd of June this year, the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, conceded that Australia had fallen into recession after what had been a remarkable run of 29 years. And I think I've got a clip of Josh Frydenberg.
Is Australia in recession today?
Well, the answer to that is yes, and that is on the basis of the advice that I have from the Treasury Department about where the June quarter is expected to be. So the first slide shows that at 0.3%, we're seeing the economy contract in the March quarter, but we're still seeing growth of 1.4% through the year. Next slide. This is the global comparison. This is a very powerful and relevant chart. At 0.3%, we compare to Japan at 0.9%. Korea, a little bit higher. The United States, as I said, at 1.3%. The OECD average is more than 6 times what we've seen in Australia. So the average fall across the OECD is 6 times what we've seen here in Australia. The United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, France at nearly 6%, Italy, and then of course China at 9.8%, which saw the coronavirus emanate from. That chart shows Australia's relative performance in the face of a global, once-in-a-century pandemic.
We can see there the Treasurer conceding a recession, which is something that politicians very much don't like to do, but placing the blame squarely on the coronavirus. And the Treasurer is also giving, I guess, a glass half full comparison there with other countries' drops in GDP. So a recession, for those who are not familiar with the technical definition, is defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. It surprises me it doesn't happen more often, actually. So GDP growth is the growth in, well, the gross domestic product, but it's related to the amount of activity in the economy, the amount of money moving through the economy. There's another article there from the ABC, which you can have a look at. Australia in its first recession for 29 years as March quarter GDP shrinks. Now, I have updated that because since this was put together, the accounts for the next quarter have been released. At this stage, the Treasurer was actually announcing the prediction of a recession, because in fact there'd only been 1 quarter of negative GDP growth, minus 0.3%. But when the reporter actually asked, rather than doing what they normally do, which is to say they'll wait and see it was clear that it was going to be the case, so he conceded it was a recession. Since then, just last week, the June quarter statement of the national accounts was released by the Treasurer, and you can have a look at the Treasurer's actual speech for the details. So that was released last week, and you would have seen on that graph where Frydenberg was comparing Australia with other countries. He was talking about a 0.3% drop compared with larger figures going down to as much as 10%. As I said, it could be some timing related things, but the September quarter has actually dropped by 7%. So that's, as they say in these days, unprecedented drop. That's the largest quarterly fall on record. So a very significant drop. So I'm not going to dwell on that. It's not all good news, but I think the good news is that if you're studying data science, then you're going to be on the right side of things coming out of recession when there's growth in the economy, more jobs and more new jobs. I have just got a link also to an article at the Conversation, which is just, I guess, a good example of data science in action. You can see there, this is the changes in gross domestic product, and you can see how sort of unprecedented that is in terms of since here, it's only since 1960 here, so it doesn't include, for example, the Great Depression, for instance. But there are a number of other graphs there about explaining about household income growth, what people are doing with their money, more saving, less spending, and so forth. So that's just an example that you can have a look at as an example of data science in action. So I don't want to dwell on that particularly, but what I did want to look at was something that was on the news around the same time as that announcement, the concession about Australia going into recession, which was a news report by Alan Kohler, who's the ABC's finance guy. Unfortunately, the actual video from the ABC has been taken down now, and the only copy I have of it doesn't have sound. So rather than get everyone to lip read that, we'll just take it from the picture here. So Alan Kohler, in this report, he states, so he's talking about population, GDP growth per capita, that probably should say. And he's saying that the per capita GDP growth has been in trend decline for decades. And he puts up this graph here. Okay, so this is the annual percent change in gross domestic product. He doesn't say whether it's seasonally adjusted or raw figures at this stage. But here's the graph, and this white line indicates the claimed trend line. Okay, so he's saying it's been in trend decline for decades. These are the decades he's got are from about 1995, so about 2.5 decades, and he's got this trend line. So what I want you to look at here in this graph, we see a lot of these graphs on TV. Actually, the quality of the graphs we see on TV are pretty bad in general. My question is, can you see anything strange about this graph, and how could you confirm whether you are right? So have a think about that one.